Have you ever wondered why some families seem trapped in cycles of unspoken expectations and emotional distance? You might recognize this pattern in your own life, where love gets expressed through worry, protection becomes control, and the very bonds meant to nurture end up constraining. Perhaps you've watched your adult children struggle to find their own path while feeling guilty about the sacrifices you made for them. Or maybe you've found yourself caught between wanting to support their dreams and fearing they'll make the same mistakes that once broke your heart. The truth is, many of us inherit ways of loving that were shaped by previous generations' fears and limitations. What we think is protecting our loved ones might actually be preventing them from becoming who they're meant to be. The patterns that govern our closest relationships often run deeper than we realize, passing silently from one generation to the next like invisible threads. When you look closely at family dynamics, you'll notice how emotional habits get handed down. The tendency to stay quiet instead of speaking your truth, the reflexive need to shield others from disappointment, or the unconscious belief that love must be earned through compliance. These inherited ways of being can create invisible barriers between people who desperately want to connect. Your children may feel obligated to honor your sacrifices by limiting their own ambitions, while you may find yourself repeating protective behaviors that once kept you safe, but now keep you isolated. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward breaking free from them. The challenge many face in later life is recognizing when protection becomes limitation and when independence becomes loneliness. You may have spent decades building walls to keep pain out, only to discover they also keep love at bay. Perhaps you've noticed how your attempts to spare your adult children from hardship sometimes feel like you're dismissing their capacity to handle their own lives. Or you might see how your fierce self-reliance, while admirable, leaves little room for the vulnerability that genuine connection requires. These realizations can be uncomfortable, but they're also liberating because they point toward the possibility of relating differently. What you're about to discover are the hidden dynamics that shape how families love, limit, and let go of each other. Through understanding concepts like inherited silence, protective resistance, and the delicate balance between supporting and smothering, you'll gain insight into why some relationships feel stuck and others flourish. You'll learn to recognize when emotional obligations are masquerading as love, and how to distinguish between healthy boundaries and defensive walls. Most importantly, you'll see how awareness of these patterns can transform not just your relationships, but your understanding of what it means to love someone well. This exploration will show you that breaking generational cycles isn't about blame or regret. It's about consciousness and choice. You'll discover that the same strength that helped you survive difficult times can be redirected toward creating the kind of connections you've always wanted. The courage it takes to examine these deep patterns is the same courage that allows for genuine intimacy and mutual respect. When you understand how emotional scripts get passed down, you gain the power to write new ones, and perhaps most importantly, you'll learn that it's never too late to transform how you love and how you allow yourself to be loved. To illustrate this, let me tell you a story about two women whose lives perfectly capture the complexity of inherited emotional patterns. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and worn wood as 44-year-old Isla stood by the counter, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, the blade rhythmically hitting the cutting board. Across the table sat her 20-year-old daughter, Nova, hunched over with fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. An acceptance letter to a prestigious music conservatory, folded so tightly in her other hand it might tear. Isla had constructed her entire life around safeguarding Nova from the uncertainties and failures she herself had endured, having once dreamed of culinary school in the city, but never finding the courage to leave their small town. Nova had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now felt caught in the familiar pattern of inherited silence that had shaped their household for years. From a young age, she had learned that in their home, ambitions were swallowed rather than spoken, and that self-preservation required emotional restraint. She was quietly determined and creative, finally ready to pursue her dream of becoming a professional musician, despite her mother's long-standing skepticism about artistic careers. The weight of unspoken dreams filled the autumn morning air as both women prepared for a conversation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and letting go. If you're finding value in this exploration of family dynamics, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights into navigating life's deeper challenges. Finally, Nova spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I got in to the conservatory. The words felt too small for the weight they carried, hanging in the air between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. She watched her mother's hands pause mid-chop, the knife suspended above the cutting board, before resuming their mechanical rhythm without Isla ever looking up. That's far, Isla replied, her tone flat and procedural, as if discussing the weather rather than her daughter's future. Her mind immediately launched into a familiar litany of concerns, questions about the cost of living, safety in a big city, whether Nova had thought about health insurance or how she'd support herself. Each question landed like a small stone, thrown into still water, creating ripples of doubt that Nova felt spreading through her chest. Beneath Isla's pragmatic veneer was a protective resistance that had been building for 20 years, a reflex born from her own disappointments and the dreams she'd buried to keep their small life stable. In Isla's mind, Nova's dream wasn't just impractical, it was dangerous. Her entire identity had become anchored in protecting Nova from the kind of failures that had crushed her own youthful aspirations. She remembered standing in a similar kitchen 24 years ago, holding her own acceptance letter to culinary school, watching her mother's face cloud with worry about money and risk. The pattern was repeating itself with an almost mathematical precision, each generation's fears becoming the next generation's limitations. Nova listened to her mother's concerns, her stomach twisting with the familiar knot of emotional obligation that had shaped her entire childhood. She had never asked Isla for her sacrifices, the double shifts at the diner, the nights spent helping with homework instead of pursuing her own interests, the dreams set aside so Nova could have music lessons and a stable home. But their very existence made her feel indebted, as if every choice she made had to honor the life her mother had given up. To choose her own path now felt like betrayal, as though leaving was an erasure of all her mother had invested in keeping her safe and close. The kitchen fell into one of their inherited silences, the kind that had become as familiar as breathing. In their household, these silences were different from comfortable quiet. They were dense with unspoken fears and swallowed desires. Nova had learned early that certain topics were not discussed, that ambitions beyond their small town were met with practical objections that felt more like emotional barriers. Isla had learned her own version of silence from her mother, who believed that hopes spoken aloud were more likely to be shattered. But today, something was different in Nova. She could feel a quiet insistence rising in her chest, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She stood up slowly, folding the acceptance letter with deliberate care, and looked directly at her mother for the first time since the conversation began. "Mum, I'm going. I have to." The words came out steady and sure, surprising them both. It was her individuation crisis, the defining moment when a child must separate from familial expectations to forge their own path, even when that path leads away from everything familiar. Isla's hands stilled completely now, the knife forgotten. As she stared at the half-chopped vegetables, she felt something breaking inside her chest, not just heartbreak, but the shattering of an entire worldview. For 2 decades, she had defined herself as Nova's protector, the steady force that would ensure her daughter never experienced the kind of disappointment that had nearly destroyed Isla's faith in possibility. Now she was confronting the painful truth that her protection had become a cage, and Nova was choosing freedom over safety. "You don't understand what it's like out there," Isla said quietly, her voice cracking for the first time. "I've seen what happens to people who chase dreams that are too big for them. I've seen how hard they fall." She was thinking of her own mother, who had once sung in local clubs before marriage, and children made such frivolity seem selfish. She was thinking of herself, standing in that same diner 20 years later, serving coffee to travelers heading toward lives she'd never dared to claim. Nova felt the weight of generations in her mother's words, the accumulated fears of women who had learned to make themselves smaller to fit into safer spaces. But she also felt something else, a clarity that cut through the familiar fog of guilt and obligation. What if I don't fall, Mom? What if I actually succeed? What if the thing you're most afraid of is the very thing that's supposed to happen? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Isla had built her identity upon. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the fragile child she'd been protecting, but a young woman with her own strength, her own dreams, her own capacity to handle whatever life might bring. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. This moment of recognition that Nova had grown beyond the boundaries Isla had carefully constructed. "I can't promise I won't worry," Isla admitted, her voice barely audible. "I can't promise I won't want to call you every day and ask if you're eating enough or sleeping enough or if you need money." She paused, looking down at her hands, still clutching the knife. "But I can promise I'll try to let you find out who you're supposed to be." Nova felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. This wasn't the dramatic reconciliation she'd imagined in her rehearsals of this conversation, but it was something more valuable. It was real acknowledgement of the complexity of loving someone enough to let them go. She walked around the table and put her arms around her mother, feeling how tightly Isla held her, as if memorizing the weight and warmth of her presence. "I'll call you every Sunday," Nova whispered. "And I'll come home for holidays. And I'll send you recordings of everything I learn." These weren't empty promises, but genuine offerings, ways of honoring the love that had shaped her, while still claiming the life that called to her. Isla nodded against her daughter's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, trying to memorize this moment before everything changed. She understood now that her protective resistance had been born from love, but love sometimes meant stepping back rather than stepping in. It meant trusting that the strength she'd tried to teach Nova through caution could also be expressed through courage. As Nova gathered her things and prepared to leave for her afternoon shift at the music store, both women felt the seismic shift that had occurred in their relationship. The old dynamic of protector and protected was evolving into something more complex and ultimately more loving, a connection between two adults who could support each other's growth rather than limit it. The door clicked shut behind Nova, leaving Isla alone in the kitchen with her half-prepared meal and the echo of their conversation. She stared at the empty chair where her daughter had been sitting and realized that in her relentless quest to protect Nova from disappointment, she had never prepared herself for this moment of letting go. But perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. Perhaps the courage to face her own fears about Nova's future was the final gift she could give her daughter. When we look at Isla and Nova's story, we can see several powerful dynamics at work that many families experience but rarely name. First, there's the concept of inherited silence, how emotional restraint becomes a generational habit, leaving desires and fears unspoken. Isla learned from her mother that dreams were dangerous things to voice, and she unconsciously passed this lesson to Nova through years of gentle discouragement, disguised as practical concern. We also witness protective resistance in action, when love manifests as attempts to shield rather than support, ultimately stifling individuality. Idla's every instinct told her that protecting Nova meant keeping her close and safe, but this protection had become a limitation on Nova's ability to discover her own strength and capacity. The emotional obligation that Nova felt is another crucial element. The burden children often carry to honor parental sacrifices at the cost of their own identity. Nova's guilt about pursuing her dreams wasn't rooted in selfishness, but in genuine love and gratitude for everything Isla had given up for her. This burden can become so heavy that children sacrifice their own authentic path to avoid seeming ungrateful. Finally, we see Nova's individuation crisis, that defining moment when a child must separate from familial expectations to forge their own path. This isn't rebellion for its own sake, but a necessary developmental step that allows young adults to discover who they are beyond their family roles. The courage it takes to have this conversation, to risk disappointing someone you love, is immense. What makes this story particularly poignant is how both women were operating from love, yet their different expressions of that love created conflict. Isla's love looked like protection and practical concern. Nova's love looked like honoring her mother's sacrifices. Neither was wrong, but both were incomplete until they could acknowledge the other's perspective and find a way to love that included both safety and freedom, both gratitude and independence. Transformation that occurred in their kitchen that morning didn't solve everything, but it opened a door to a different kind of relationship. One based on mutual respect rather than protective control, on trust rather than fear. This is the kind of shift that becomes possible when we're willing to examine the inherited patterns that shape how we love and let them evolve into something more conscious and life-giving. If this story resonates with your own family experience, I'd love to hear about it. Please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. The patterns we see in parent-child relationships often repeat themselves in different forms throughout our lives, creating what we might call relational impasses, those emotional deadlocks where both parties yearn for connection but remain paralyzed by their own defenses. To help you see this more clearly, I want to tell you another story that captures how these dynamics can persist well into our later years, sometimes requiring us to confront the very foundations of how we've learned to survive. The hospital room was quiet, save for the muted hum of machines and the occasional clatter of carts. In the hallway, 62-year-old Ilara sat upright in bed, her hospital gown crisp, her posture rigid despite the fatigue that pulled at her limbs. The cardiac event that had brought her here 3 days ago had been her body's way of demanding attention she'd spent decades refusing to give herself. Across from her, 35-year-old Callie perched in a chair by the window, scrolling absently through her phone while stealing glances at her mother, unsure how to navigate the familiar space of emotional distance that seemed to widen even in this sterile room. For years, they had lived in a relational impasse that felt as permanent as the hospital walls around them. Callie yearning for closeness, Ilara deflecting any attempt at vulnerability with dismissive quips or practical advice that kept feelings at arm's length. Even now, after the heart scare that had terrified them both, Ilara waved away Callie's concerns with a cool, "Don't fuss, I'm fine." The words had become her armor, a reflexive response that had served her through decades of raising Callie alone after her husband's death when Callie was just 7 years old. But Callie could see through what she'd come to recognize as her mother's illusion of self-sufficiency. Ilara's fierce independence had always been her defining characteristic, forged from a life that had demanded she survive without leaning on others. She had raised Callie with the unspoken message that strength meant never showing weakness, that asking for help was tantamount to admitting failure. Yet now, in the fluorescent light of the hospital, her fragility was undeniable. The way she gripped the bed rail when she thought no one was looking, the sharp intake of breath when shifting, her weight, the tremor in her hands when reaching for the water glass. The afternoon stretched between them with the weight of unspoken history. Callie remembered childhood evenings when she'd try to comfort her mother after particularly difficult days, only to be gently but firmly redirected toward homework or chores. She remembered bringing home drawings from school, hoping for praise, and receiving practical suggestions about improving her penmanship instead of acknowledgement of her creativity. Over the years, she had learned that emotional needs were inconveniences in their household, that love was expressed through provision and protection rather than affection and vulnerability. Later that afternoon, Jonas arrived with a small potted plant tucked under his arm and a book of crossword puzzles in his hand. At 64, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to pay attention to his body's messages. He had been Ilara's neighbor for 15 years, watching from across the fence as she maintained her garden with military precision and raised Callie with the same unwavering discipline. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared morning coffee conversations and his patient presence during the times when Ilara's walls came down just enough to reveal glimpses of the woman behind them. "Brought you something to keep your mind busy," Jonas said, settling the plant on the windowsill where it caught the last rays of afternoon sunlight. His voice carried the comfortable warmth of someone who had learned not to push, but simply to be present. He chatted with Ilara about mundane neighborhood news, Mrs. Henderson's new cat, the ongoing street repair project, the upcoming community garden meeting, topics that felt safe and normal in a place where nothing felt either safe or normal. After an hour of gentle conversation, Jonas excused himself to speak with Callie in the hallway. They stood near the elevator, surrounded by the hospital's constant symphony of beeping monitors and hushed conversations. "You know," he said softly, his eyes kind but direct. "Sometimes strength looks like letting someone help." His words carried the weight of his own experience. He had been a teacher for 37 years, watching countless students struggle with the difference between independence and isolation. His observation pierced something deep in Callie, surfacing what she had come to understand as her transgenerational burden, the implicit belief that love must be earned through perfect patience, that care was conditional on proving oneself capable of handling whatever emotional distance her mother required. It was a script that had been passed from mother to daughter, perhaps stretching back even further to grandmothers who had learned that survival meant emotional self-reliance above all else. The realization hit Callie with startling clarity as she stood in that hospital corridor. She could trace the pattern through her own relationships, how she had learned to love people by giving them space rather than intimacy, how she had mistaken emotional restraint for respect, how she had spent her adult life trying to earn closeness through perfect behavior rather than authentic connection. The transgenerational burden wasn't just about what her mother had passed down. It was about what Callie was unconsciously preparing to pass forward if she ever had children of her own. That evening, after Jonas had gone home and the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm, Callie sat with her mother in the semi-darkness, both women lost in their own thoughts. The machines continued their steady beeping, marking time like a metronome, counting the beats of all the conversations they had never had. Callie watched her mother's profile against the pillow and saw not the invincible woman who had raised her, but someone who had learned to equate vulnerability with danger so thoroughly that even a heart attack couldn't pierce her defenses. After sitting through another hour of Ilara's stoic silence, something shifted in Callie. She felt a trembling in her hands that she recognized as fear, but also as the precursor to necessary action. She stood up slowly, moved to her mother's bedside, and did something she hadn't done since childhood. She leaned over and kissed her, Mother's forehead, feeling the paper-thin skin and the warmth that proved life still pulsed beneath all that careful control. "I can't keep waiting for you to let me in," Callie whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I love you, but I need more than this distance. I need more than practical advice and deflected conversations. Need to know you as a person, not just as my mother." It was her boundary assertion, a necessary rupture designed not to punish, but to preserve her own emotional well-being and create space for a different kind of relationship. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned. Callie felt the weight of the moment, understanding that this was her own individuation crisis, different from Nova's, but equally crucial. She was choosing her emotional health over the familiar patterns that had defined their relationship, risking her mother's anger or withdrawal in service of something more authentic. Callie gathered her purse and jacket, moving with deliberate calm toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at her mother one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow, but I won't pretend anymore that this distance is normal or healthy. We both deserve better than this." She left without looking back, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she carried herself toward whatever came next. Ilara sat motionless in the sterile room, her hand unconsciously reaching toward the space where Callie's had just been. The silence that followed felt different from their usual comfortable distance. It felt hollow, charged with the absence of words that had finally been spoken. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of loneliness, not as an inevitable condition of strength, but as something she had chosen over and over again in the name of self-protection. The realization crept over her slowly, like dawn breaking over familiar landscape and revealing details that had always been there but never fully seen. Her fierce independence, the armor she had worn so proudly, had indeed protected her from disappointment and vulnerability. But it had also protected her from the very connection she had spent her life longing for without ever admitting that longing existed. She thought of Jonas, who somehow managed to be strong without being distant, who offered help without making her feel weak, who had learned the difference between independence and isolation. In the hours that followed Callie's departure, Ilara found herself reviewing decades of interactions with new eyes. She remembered Callie's graduation from college, how her daughter had looked for her in the crowd afterward, eyes bright with accomplishment and hope for shared celebration. Ilara had responded with practical questions about job prospects and student loans rather than the pride and joy that had actually filled her heart. She remembered birthdays when Callie had tried to create traditions of closeness, only to encounter Ilara's discomfort with sentiment disguised as efficiency. The star pattern became clear with painful precision. Ilara's illusion of self-sufficiency had required her to minimize not just her own needs, but her daughter's need for emotional connection. Every deflection, every practical response to emotional offerings, every time she had chosen distance over intimacy had been a choice to prioritize her own comfort over their relationship. The transgenerational burden had flowed both ways. She had passed down emotional restraint as a survival skill, but she had also inherited it from her own mother, who had learned it from hers. As the night deepened around her, Ilara began to understand that Callie's boundary assertion had been an act of love, not abandonment. By refusing to continue participating in their relational impasse, Callie was offering them both a chance at something more authentic. The question now was whether Ilara had the courage to step toward the vulnerability that genuine connection required, or whether she would retreat further into the familiar territory of emotional self-sufficiency. When we examine Ilara and Callie's story, we see how the dynamics we observed in Isla and Nova's relationship can persist and evolve across different life stages. The relational impasse between Ilara and Callie represents what happens when both people in a relationship want connection, but have learned incompatible ways of seeking it. Callie's approach involved persistent attempts to create intimacy, while Ilara's involved maintaining distance as a form of emotional safety. The concept of illusion of self-sufficiency becomes particularly relevant in later life, when the very independence we've cultivated as a source of pride can become a barrier to receiving the care and connection we actually need. Ilara's fierce independence served her well during the crisis years of single parenthood, but it had calcified into something that prevented her from accepting help or showing vulnerability, even when her health was at risk. The transgenerational burden in this story flows in multiple directions. Ilara inherited emotional restraint as a survival mechanism and passed it to Callie, who learned that love meant accepting distance and that emotional needs were inconveniences. But Callie's boundary assertion represents her recognition that she could choose differently, that the script she had inherited didn't have to define her future relationships. Most significantly, we see how boundary assertion can be an act of love rather than rejection. Callie's decision to stop participating in their emotional deadlock wasn't meant to punish her mother, but to create space for a more authentic relationship. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable patterns that hurt everyone involved, even when that refusal feels risky or uncomfortable. If you're recognizing similar patterns in your own family relationships, please like this video to let me know this content is helping you understand these complex dynamics. Through the stories of Isla and Nova and Ilara and Callie, we've witnessed how powerful emotional patterns can shape families across generations, creating both connection and distance in ways we don't always recognize. These stories illuminate 8 crucial insights that can transform how you understand your own relationships and the legacy you're creating for future generations. The first pattern we explored was inherited silence, how emotional restraint becomes a generational habit, leaving desires and fears unspoken. You might recognize this in your own family, where certain topics remain off-limits, not because they're forbidden, but because no one learned how to talk about them safely. When you understand this pattern, you can begin to break it by choosing to speak truths that previous generations kept hidden, creating space for more authentic connection. We also examined protective resistance, when love manifests as attempts to shield rather than support, ultimately stifling individuality. Perhaps you found yourself offering warnings instead of encouragement, or practical concerns instead of emotional support. This pattern often comes from genuine love and fear of seeing your loved ones hurt, but it can prevent them from developing their own strength and resilience. The challenge is learning to love in ways that empower rather than limit. The weight of emotional obligation appeared in both stories, showing how children often feel burdened to honor parental sacrifices at the cost of their own identity. If you're a parent, you might consider whether your sacrifices have become chains that bind your children to choices they wouldn't naturally make. If you're an adult child, you might examine whether guilt about past sacrifices is preventing you from living authentically in the present. The individuation crisis represents those defining moments when someone must separate from familial expectations to forge their own path. These moments are necessary for healthy development, but they can feel like betrayal to parents who've invested everything in their children's lives. Understanding this as a natural process rather than a personal rejection can transform how families navigate these crucial transitions. In Ilara and Callie's story, we witnessed a relational impasse, those long-standing emotional deadlocks where both parties yearn for connection but remain paralyzed by their own defenses. You might recognize these stalemates in your own relationships, where the same conversations lead to the same frustrations year after year. Breaking these patterns requires someone to risk vulnerability and change the dynamic, even when it feels uncertain or uncomfortable. The illusion of self-sufficiency revealed how the appearance of independence can mask deeper needs for intimacy and support. This pattern becomes particularly relevant as we age, when the very strength that helped us survive earlier challenges can become a barrier to receiving care and maintaining meaningful connections. True strength sometimes means allowing others to help and share in both our struggles and our joys. We explored how transgenerational burdens carry unconscious roles and emotional scripts across generations, creating invisible expectations that family members feel compelled to fulfill. These burdens aren't always negative. They can include positive qualities like resilience and determination, but they become problematic when they limit people's ability to choose their own path or express their authentic selves. Finally, we saw how boundary assertion can be a critical act of establishing emotional limits to foster genuine connection and personal growth. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in patterns that hurt everyone involved, even when that refusal feels risky or meets with resistance. These 8 patterns aren't just abstract concepts, they're living dynamics that shape how you love, limit, and let go of the people who matter most to you. The beautiful truth is that awareness creates choice. When you can see these patterns operating in your relationships, you gain the power to respond differently, to break cycles that no longer serve, and to create new ways of connecting that honor both individual growth and family bonds. As you reflect on these stories and insights, I want you to consider your own relationships honestly. Where do you see inherited silence operating in your family? What forms does your protective resistance take, and how might it be limiting the people you love? Are there emotional obligations weighing on your relationships that need to be addressed with compassion and clarity? Most importantly, how are you going to apply these lessons in your daily interactions? Will you choose to speak a truth that's been kept silent? Will you offer support instead of warnings? Will you assert a boundary that creates space for more authentic connection? The courage to examine these deep patterns is the same courage that allows for genuine transformation in how you love and allow yourself to be loved. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with the decision to see clearly and act consciously. You have the power to write new scripts for your relationships, to break patterns that limit love, and to create a legacy of emotional freedom for the generations that follow. The question isn't whether you're capable of this transformation. The question is whether you're willing to begin. If this exploration of family dynamics has inspired you to look more deeply at your own relationships and consider how you might love more consciously, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights into navigating life's deeper challenges.